We can get started. All right. Thank you all for joining. I'm going to, how do I mute everybody real fast? Just make sure your camera's on mute there. I don't know how to necessarily always mute everybody. Oh, Chris King. What's going on? Good to see you, man. All right. No, it's fine. I muted it. You're good. All right. So I don't claim to be a church historian. I read a lot of church history and try to grasp everything that was going on. But by and large, church history is very big and very hard to sort of like put your finger on everything happening at any particular given time. Hold on. Let me figure out how I can change a setting here real fast. Participants. Oh, there we go. All right. So if you want to chime in at any point, anybody, just unmute yourself and hop in and say what's up. You don't have to raise your hand or anything. I may not notice that. But church history is very big. Lots of things going on at any given time. And we must admit that like most of what we have is only from a perspective that we have chosen to preserve or pay attention to. So there's still today, we're always still learning new things that were going on at different places in the world. For instance, if you ask people what was happening in church history 500 years ago, they're going to talk about the Protestant Reformation. But the fact is there was other things happening too. They just don't take center place in history. So what I want to do is I want to sort of give if I can, sort of a well-balanced sort of view of like as many things going on as possible. I'm not really going to focus on I'm not necessarily going to focus on like medieval and Protestant church history. I'm going to try to go back to the beginning, early church history, the very beginning. And I was telling the people who were here early that while I've been doing these little classes online, I've found that I've been gathering too much information and making the classes go too long and giving people too much. And it's been stifling sort of conversation of like how much time we have to ask questions. So I want to do these in little chunks. I want to give like a quick today sort of a way of understanding the early church history, like the church fathers, first, second, and third century, what was going on there, like a couple lenses through which to look at stuff. And then from here on out, I want to sort of maybe pick individual characters of things that were happening at the same time and sort of talk about those. So I'm going to start, I guess, today, and I have like an iPad I want to draw on a couple of times. I want to show you a map and show you some stuff happening. And if at any point there's stuff that I say that you're like, I want to hear more about that, let me know. And if I don't necessarily know that much about that particular subject, then I will grab some of my books and read and find out for you. And then we can talk about it maybe at the next one. That's how the Q&A can really help make it better. So I want to start off sort of talking about, let's see, where am I here? No, class notes. Okay. Doing Christian history, how it works. I think most people have this, it's sort of a chicken and egg kind of thing. And I was in a class the other day with a bunch of people talking in depth about this sort of analogy of like chicken versus egg. Let's say the egg would be like, we found this ancient artifact in this ancient document. So you have a guy who wrote some stuff. It's usually a guy. I'm also reading some books right now about women in church history and a lot of their primary readings as well. So I'll bring some of that in as well. But the way a lot of theologians do history is not very helpful. The way they do church history is we have this idea, this belief, this theology, predestination or transubstantiation, and then they try to trace it backwards to the egg. So how did this idea come forth? Where did this idea come from? But what happens is you're injecting sort of history, your reading of history with ideas already before you even get there. You're trying to find the start of an idea. And it's not a good way to do history. It's probably the least accurate way to do church history. The most accurate way to do church history is to gather up what we would call primary sources. Primary sources are the people who wrote the books back then. You have Origen and Tertullian, Irenaeus, Hippolytus. You have all these people, and you read their writings to determine what they're saying and what they believe. And from here, you work forward through church history to figure out what's really going on instead of working backwards. Most people are trying to work backwards. It's not helpful. You're going to come up with all kinds of misinformation. I've done it myself. And so there's several tools you need for history. You need primary sources, which are simply the writings of like Origen is a primary source. The writings of Tertullian is a primary source. The writings of Clement is a primary source. And you read their writings to figure out exactly what they believed. And then there are secondary sources. We don't actually have a lot of writing from Origen. What we actually have, because most of them, he was declared a heretic and a lot of his stuff was destroyed. But we know he wrote like 6,000 documents. And so what we end up doing is we read Origen oftentimes through the people writing against him. So you have all these people who wrote these books telling you what Origen said and then arguing against them. These can be somewhat reliable. A lot of our writings that we have today of Origen have been gathered in this way, from his opponents. But that's fine. Many of them were preserved pretty well. So there's different ways that like you can learn these things. You have artifacts you can read and look at. You have ancient. There's other historians. Really, the first church historian that we have is Luke. He was the one that wrote the Gospel of Luke. He's the one that wrote the Book of Acts. And he tells you right up front who he was hired by, Theophilus. And it says that he was hired to write an orderly account, he says. So he tells you right up front, I'm doing history. This is what I'm doing. And he goes around and he talks to all kinds of sources that are around, that knew the apostles, that saw Jesus, that knew Mary, spoke with these people, and he's writing down their accounts, and he's keeping track of what they're doing throughout his two-part series. He has the Gospel of Luke, which is the story of Jesus, and then you have the Gospel of Acts, which is the story of the church, and he pairs them in a way, volume 1 and volume 2, he pairs them in a way to sort of say, here's what Jesus did, here's what the church did, and by the way, they're the same thing. They were doing the exact same thing. After that, the second historian that we really have is this guy Eusebius. And I've never been sure if I'm saying that right, but that's regular for me. I'm always saying their names wrong. But Eusebius of Caesarea, he wrote the real first church history book outside of Luke. He wrote at the beginning of the 4th century, he covered 300 years of church history. And we have his, he revealed a lot. He wrote a book called Ecclesial History. Ecclesia is the Greek word for church. So he wrote his book, Church History. Now, I think the main thing I wanted to do today was give you sort of a lens through which to view all the characters that I want to talk about. And I'm not necessarily going to talk about any of the characters today. I want to pick a character a week, a church father a week, and talk about that particular church father. And there's a lot of reasons I want to do this. I want you to know them, but I also want to learn about them more myself. And I figured we can do this together sort of in community. And bring up all kinds of interesting questions about these people and sort of interact with the things that they wrote and what that would mean for us today in the church. And I think it's really interesting to see what Christians actually believed at different points throughout Christian history, because people don't realize that like a lot of the things that we believe today are sort of, some of them are modern constructs that were brought up later that we can look back through history and see like, yes, we think this is like sort of the right way to look at things. And I think you'll be very surprised by, I think a lot of the things that we find. So first I want to talk about the first Christian communities on earth, the first ones that existed. Rome, obviously, the church in Rome. You have a church in Carthage, a church in Antioch, Alexandria, Cappadocia, Constantinople, Hippo, and Jerusalem. I want to show you a map of how this sort of looked. Let's see, how do I share this? I'm going to share my iPad with you. Give me just a second. No. I just did it. Okay, hold on a second. Screen mirroring and Zoom thingy. Let's see how this works. Okay, can you guys see that? See that whiteboard? And then my mistake I made there. Okay, I'm going to flip that. Okay, we got a map here that it's messy, but it is what it is. And can you see this mouse cursor when it moves around? Oh, really? Good. Look at that. That'll help a lot. Okay. That really surprises me that you can see that. Okay. Now, this is sort of ancient world here. We're going to talk about a few things on here. So Rome, right here in Italy, this would be really the very first church that we find. We have Carthage, we have Antioch, we have Carthage over here, Antioch over here. We have Cappadocia up here, where I'm going to, at some point, maybe in a few weeks, talk about the Cappadocian Fathers. They're some of my favorites. And then you have Constantinople. This would become later on sort of the center of the church. It would move from Rome to Constantinople a little later on. You have Hippo down here, where Augustine would later write from. You have Jerusalem way over here, where sort of the center of Jewish Christianity would come from. So perhaps that you've noticed that in the ancient world, there are two separate languages. When you read ancient documents from the church, you hear Latin and you hear Greek. And for many years, I never understood why, and this was always sort of a problem to me. I'd read this, like, why are these people writing in different languages? Why are ancient church fathers doing this, and why are they doing that? Why are all our plants and animals named in Latin terms? What is all of this? And so here's sort of how this worked. You have this line here, this Latin and Greek line. I've gone ahead and marked that up for you, so I don't have to do any of this live. So what you end up with is everyone to the east is Greek speaking. Everyone to the west of this line is Latin speaking. And what this means is when you look at the church around the world, you end up with, you have sort of Eastern, you have Greek Orthodox, Eastern Orthodox churches, all gathered from, like, descended from over here. And then you have what they call the Western Church. Evangelicalism is a product of the Western Church, the Reformed Church, Roman Catholicism. This is all over here from the Latin West. And so I guess you would say us, evangelicals, Protestants, we are descendants of the Latin Church, the Western Church. And as you begin to read these primary sources, you can see that they're writing in these different languages, which tells you several things. It tells you, first off, where they're coming from. It tells you a lot about their theology as well. It also tells you a lot about how they looked at the world and the viewpoint with which they're reading the Bible. And this all gets really fascinating. As you read through these primary sources, the first-hand writings of the church fathers, remember, you're going to see major differences between Eastern and Western thinking. First off, Eastern Christians, Eastern leaders of the church, Eastern theologians, first off, there are a lot of things about them. They write in Greek, and they were philosophers. They engaged with ancient philosophy a lot, regularly, constantly. They used a lot of thought. They used a lot of just rational thinking. Things had to make sense to them. They were incredibly creative in the ways that they spoke about God. You have, let me write down some of these for you here. I'm going to zoom in. I'll write them right over here. These are probably some of the ones that we're going to be talking about in the coming weeks if this thing keeps going. So Origen, we have Athanasius. Athanasius is the first one to actually give us a complete list of the canon of Scripture, of all the books of the Bible that we now have. And if you've been at Watermark, you can pay attention. I've talked about that a few times. You have the Cappadocian Fathers. Oh, I spelled this wrong. Let's see. Fathers. You have Irenaeus. Now, this is going to be weird. Let me explain this in a second. Of Lyon. Now, I know Lyon is in France, which is not the Greek-speaking East. However, Irenaeus of Lyon, though he was in the West, he originated in Asia Minor. He spoke and wrote in Greek, not Latin. His thinking is far more philosophical than anything else. We consider him sort of one of the Greek-speaking Eastern fathers of the church. And so they interpret the Bible. These Greek-speaking church fathers, they interpret the Bible very creatively. Some of them tell these fascinating stories about sort of the creation of angels. They love good storytelling. Most of them did not take the books of like Genesis literally. They looked at them as philosophical thought, as storytelling, as parable. And they were looking for the meaning in it. The way that they interpreted the Bible is fascinating. You have this guy, Origen, who who believed that every word of the Bible should be interpreted allegorically. In other words, hold on. I see a text question there in the chat. Okay. Now, he believed basically that every verse, every word of every verse in the Bible, Origen, would have this sort of allegorical meaning, and could be interpreted tons and tons of different ways, which is why if you read Origen, he's incredibly creative in the way that he writes. He retells, actually, I'll go into detail on this sometime, but he tells this story, this creation story of how we all got here. That is one of the craziest things. And I believe one of the writings of C.S. Lewis kind of copies it a little bit at one point, but he sort of tells this story of, and this is not going to fit in with anything you've ever heard within Christian Orthodoxy, but Origen tells this story about the creation of the world and mankind and angels. And he says that everyone started off sort of in this God place, really up high, and then there was this great falling. And some fell a little bit and became angels, and some fell farther and became human beings, and some fell farther and became demons, and one fell really far and became Satan. And Origen actually believed that one day all this would be brought back together and made whole again, and even Satan himself would be saved from hell. He was one of the first universalists in the church. And so, like, this is what I mean when I talk about the Greek-speaking Eastern Orthodox ancient church fathers were really creative. It lists a lot of questions up. It raises a lot of questions about, like, did he really believe this, or is he just talking to teach? That's all part for debate. You know, that's all open. Again, if he's interpreting everything in allegory, then maybe his own words are allegory as well. Maybe he's trying to teach and say something. So these are the Eastern philosophers of the church. Very important church fathers. One of the reasons they're really, really important is because they were huge in the defense against early heresies in the church, against the Gnostics, against the Docetists, against against the Arians. They actually were very nimble in their thinking and were able to defeat a lot of people that were trying to take Christianity and merge it with other modes of thought. That is why we have to read them. It's difficult for Westerners to read these kinds of writings because we just want straightforward thinking. But we don't get that there. And so you have to read them with an open mind. You have to understand that they are, almost all of them, are keeping within Orthodox Christianity in a way that they're like affirming the Nicene Creeds and the Apostles' Creed, and they're part of the early conversation, and that the Eastern and the Western Church believed that they were one church. But with that being said, let's look at the Latin-speaking Western Church for a moment here as well. The Western Latin Christian thinkers were not philosophers. They did not like philosophy. They were, for the most part, many of them were lawyers, actually. They were very straightforward thinkers. They liked law. They liked facts. They liked everything being ordered. And so many of them were literal, actual lawyers that went to school for this kind of stuff. And they cared about law and order. Their readings of the Bible are very, very systematic when you read them. And this is why Westerners are a lot more drawn to the ancient Latin writers. Their atonement theories they speak in terms of legal terms. Penal substitutionary atonement, right? Penal, that's a legal term. And so that is how they speak about many things in the Bible. That's how they talk about the fall. That's how they talk about sin It's an offense against God. You've broken the law. And now, so like they have very specific ways of talking. So that's their atonement theory. So for the most part, their interpretations of the text are very literal. They read the book of Genesis and they take it literally, although there are a couple writings of Augustine where he doesn't necessarily take a very literal writing of Genesis. And he even encourages people to think about it parabolically, as sort of, I'm wondering if he was reading it as like a mini story of Israel. That's how I read the book of Genesis. Genesis 1 and 2 are sort of this pre-telling of the story of Israel, right? Before we actually hear the story of Israel. So you have a place where God and man are together, the Garden of Eden, just like the temple. You have a falling away through disobedience, just like Israel, all of that. So you can see some of that hinted at. So for the most part, their interpretations of the text are very literal. In the West, they and where things didn't align perfectly, these were not things to be embraced. These were problems to be solved, right? Any contradictions in the text, any ways that God is displayed differently, are things that they had to solve. So they would sit down systematically like lawyers and figure these things out. They were problems to be solved. They were not necessarily things to be pondered and philosophized about as the Greek thinkers thought about things. As you can expect, whenever ecumenical councils, that means the entirety of the church, whenever they were brought together in these councils, the conversation was lively and there were a lot of debates. So I have a question here from T. Osborne. So does the scripture actually support the doctrine of penal substitutionary atonement? I want to talk about that at some point, maybe in one of the Bible for Lunches, or is this originated from these Latin church fathers? Yes and no. In the Watermark podcast, not too long ago, I taught a sermon. There's two things you need to hear. One of them, several weeks ago, I taught one, probably a couple months ago now. I did a sermon, and I think we called it How to Get Saved. It's about the gospel and defining. No, it's fine. Ask all the questions you want. I called it, How to Get Saved, I think I called it. And then over the last few weeks, before the whole worldwide shutdown here, I was teaching on atonement, and how Paul sort of lays out atonement. Sometimes when he's speaking to different audiences, he speaks about atonement differently. So for Jewish people, sometimes he uses their way of talking about atonement. And for the Gentiles, sometimes he says words like ransom, you have been ransomed, which is to buy a slave in the ancient world, which is to buy a slave and set them free. So there's different ways that he talks about it. Maybe one of our Bible for Lunches will talk about different atonement theories as well. But yeah, I mean, there's a lot of people throughout church history that would argue that it is in there, that it's plain as day that you can see it. But a lot of us, we have to remember, are products of our time. And when we talk about penal substitutionary atonement, we're thinking law, court, stuff like that, American justice system, which didn't exist back then. They had a different way of doing law, different way of doing court, different ways of doing lawyers entirely. So famous Western church fathers, I'll write them right over here, messily in this random space. Obviously, Augustine of Hippo. He's one of the premier sort of doctors of the Catholic Church. He's where, from Augustine, you can trace a straight line to Anselm, and then you can trace a straight line to Luther and Calvin, where that's where Reformed theology really comes from. They're heavy on Augustine. But you also have to remember, Augustine is a part of history. We'll talk about Augustine too, but Augustine is a product of his time as well. Augustine came to Christ out of Gnosticism. And so he had predetermined ideas about the human soul. He believed he may be responsible for the general belief that the human soul is innately immortal, that your human soul will live on forever. That's not actually in the Bible. We find that in church history. That he came out of Gnosticism, and this is one of their ideas. And so it's possible that he imported this, but actually the Gnostics actually believed that it actually existed like Plato, that the soul existed not just forward forever, but also backwards forever. So we already existed. But Augustine doesn't seem to have brought that in. And so sometimes where we came from will determine how we read the Bible. Yeah, and so I think you'll see all this as we move through church history. You have Tertullian, 2 L's, I-A-N. Tertullian is from Carthage. We'll talk about him as well. We have, that's the wrong name there. We'll also talk about Cyprian of Carthage as well. I have other church fathers. I'm gonna find more and put them in there because I at least want to have 4 of each that we want to do over time here. Daniel 11. Let me come back to that question. He asked, what does it mean that eternity is written on the hearts of man? That's a great question. Let's think on that in a little bit here. Now, because of all of this, we have completely different ways, again, of thinking about the Bible, going in different directions. This is why when you meet someone who is Eastern Orthodox, you may be very surprised by the way that they talk about God. But they are still considered a Christian. They are still our brothers and sisters in Christ. I think most Christians assume that all other Christians believe everything that they believe about everything. But this is actually why we have the creeds. This is why we study church history, so that we can see that we should be more graceful with each other. Because of all of this, the East and the West, because of the different modes of thinking, they will be at odds with each other for almost the entirety of Christian history. They will constantly be at odds with each other, but they will be forced to work together through much of it. And at some point, this is all going to culminate in around 1054 with what's called the Great Schism, or some call it schism. I like schism. I don't know. I like to emphasize the K. The Great Schism, where East and West are divided, and they never really came back together. A lot of this can be traced back to something that Augustine actually did wrong in one of the councils. And we're going to talk about that as well. He misunderstood some of the nuances between Greek and Latin beliefs in Christianity. And he was Augustine was bad at Greek. He didn't, this is the documents, like the ancient writings that we have about it. Historians tell us that, he didn't pay very well attention in Greek class. And he ended up causing a rift with inserting this thing called the filioque, when he talks about the Spirit, the Son emanating not just from the Father, but from the Spirit. And now we'll talk about that another time too. And that offended, apparently, a lot of the Eastern Greeks so bad that it caused a rift that was never fixed until this day. So until now, there were 7, some will talk about 9, ecumenical councils where the East and West came together to solve some problems. And it never happened again after pretty early on. And so all this around 1054, the Great Schism, the dividing of East and West is sort of the final later on, despite 2 direct attempts to sort of reunite these, the Council of Lyon, the Council of Florence. One of them was in the 13th century. One of them was in the 15th century. Both of these failed to reunite the Eastern and Western Church. And I like to say that church history isn't done, that it's possible that the Eastern and Western Church one day could come back together. However, throughout all of church history, there's also this unity under the early Christian creeds. If you take communion, you are taking communion with all Christians around the world. They all take it. Now, there are many Christians who will deny you communion in their gatherings because you don't agree with certain things the way they believe. I can't go today to Turkey and walk into an Orthodox church there and take communion. They won't let me. I would let them at Watermark, though. I think there may be a difference. However, throughout all of church history, there's this unity in sort of the creeds, and a lot of church history is simply the reunification and expansion of the Nicene Creed. Every time there is a council that comes together, what they're doing is they're not creating new ideas. They're solidifying the original creed, which is simply a description of God, Trinitarian, Father, Son, Spirit, and how the relationship of God exists. for church history, this is where all the debates of heresy reside, is in the councils. Heresy resides in simply two things. How you describe the Trinity, how it functions, and your what's called Christology, how you define the divinity of Christ and the humanity of Christ and how they come together. These are really, as far as church history is concerned, the only two places where heresy can exist. If someone calls you a heretic for not believing in their version of heaven or hell or reading of Genesis, they're out of line as far as church history goes. Heresy exists in, I guess we don't need this anymore. I can close this up. Heresy simply exists in those two places. And let me stop sharing this here. Heresy simply exists in those two places, Christology and Trinitarian theology. So I guess we have a lot of time where we need to spend on, I want to start hitting off these one-off, maybe two-off per session here of like who these church fathers were and what they did and what they believed. And I kind of want to go back and forth to create evenness in what you're seeing, because they're all important. I don't lean on Eastern or Western church fathers. I want to read all of them so I can know what was going on, so I can get to the heart of what was the most important thing. So we'll talk about cities, we'll talk about events and creeds and the church fathers, and try to move forward. So I want to look at some of these things here that you've written. Daniel 11, let's go to that one. So what does it mean that eternity is written on the hearts of man? I'm going to be honest with you, I never really looked into that. I've never actually sat and pondered that. So I could try to just throw an answer out there, but that's not really my style. I like to sort of look into something and try to know what I'm talking about. And I'll be honest, I don't know a lot about Thomas Aquinas. I've not spent a lot of time with his readings. I've never been real big into apologetics. And to me, that's where sort of that has always sort of fallen. But I plan on one day getting around to it. Ruth Jones, I was surprised in a college religion class to learn that some Greek Orthodox believe in reincarnation. That knowledge was from Greek students' presentation. So let me point out one instance where it appears somebody in the Bible actually hints at reincarnation. And this is weird. And this is, but I have to point it out to you. So John chapter 9. Jesus is with the disciples, and there's some Pharisees there, and they're walking upon this man who is blind, and it says he was born blind. And they ask Jesus this question: who sinned, him or his parents? But they've already established that he was born blind. You know what I mean? And then they follow it up with a question about, did he sin? And there's a lot of, I've read at least 4 different scholars who say that that this is an instance of a hint that there were likely some ancient Jewish thinkers who, a lot of them had interesting views too. That some of them were throwing around ideas of reincarnation and stuff like that. I don't necessarily see that. But that is a particular verse where like these things are put together, and I don't know why they're put together like that. These two ideas, but by and large, the Christians have not. The early Christians, the apostles, did not believe in reincarnation. It is possible. Yeah, I think I've read some. I'll try to find some. I've read there's a few philosophical church fathers here and there that sort of brought these ideas up and kicked them around and threw them in. By and large, it never took hold. It was never something really a lot of Christians believed. You could pretty much grab any idea that people throw around today and have thrown out and show that there's somebody at some point in church history who believed it and argued for it. And some of them were burned at the stake for stuff like that. But like, it's fun to pull all those out and look at the bizarreness of it all. But this is why we have the creeds. Okay. So that there is something that we can be united around. And this was historically what the church is always united around. And the creeds don't, each creed is built off the one before it. And each creed comes together and is written because what they find is you write a creed and then someone else comes up with some bizarre idea that also fits in with the creed. And they're like, okay, you took that too far. So we're going to come back together and we're going to make another creed and we're going to expand the first creed and expanded the language of it to let you know that like, we don't go this far. And so what you end up with like the last creed is this apophatic creed, which is this description of Jesus that is like, and he's without confusion, without this, without that, without that. And they're creating these, apophatic means negative. They're creating all these negative spaces to define orthodoxy without actually defining it, because heresy always arises when you try to define God. Always. If you try to tell me how the Trinity works and exactly how Trinitarian God exists, I will probably be able to point out a way in which you have just committed an ancient church heresy. Okay. People use the, I heard somebody not too long ago literally say, well, God is like the Trinitarian God. He's like water, because sometimes it's liquid and sometimes it's solid and sometimes it's a mist. Like this, and it's like Father, Son, Spirit, right? And I say, congratulations, you've just committed the heresy of modalism. Like, that existed in the 2nd century, and the church expanded the creeds to make sure that you didn't talk about God that way, because that's not how Paul talked about God. And so what we're trying to do is, with the creeds, define how the apostles, it's all about apostolic succession, which is another topic I want to talk about down the road as well. So yeah, it goes all over the place. The other instance, okay, hold on. Someone wrote, I think Daniel was saying how Augustine's conception of an immortal soul was not in the Bible, when the concept of eternal life was biblical. Yes, but you have to define sort of the Jewish understanding of eternity and eternal life. And there's two different modes of thought there. There's a lot of people who argue that when the Jews are talking about eternity, they're talking about weight, not length. They're talking about meaning and purpose. They're talking about living for eternal things that will always exist with us. There's people that argue that, and there's people that argue that no, eternity means 24-hour periods, day after the next. But I would say those ideas mostly arise post-Enlightenment. Well, maybe not strictly, but I don't think they caught on really until post-Enlightenment. By and large, the Jewish people, Jewish Palestinian Christians, I would argue, were annihilationists. They believed that God's people would be raised because God is the giver of life. And if God gave the original Adam life and his people follow after it, then God will raise God's own people. And that they fear the God who will destroy both the body and the soul in Gehenna, right? In hell. And so for them, it appears, and you can't make definitive statements about this, these are all debates. It appears as though they simply believed that there would be resurrection, and that this resurrection would be everyone at once, all God's people brought back and established. So again, their view of eternity is not the same things we're talking about. And they didn't believe the soul could separate from the body. They believed the soul was intricately interwoven with the body. And so you have all kinds of interesting issues that we Western Christians, we just take for granted. And these the ideas, when you just throw these out, they kind of mess with your theology a bit, but I think it's important to do. To try to have a consistent ethic of reading the Bible. I try to read through a Jewish lens, Palestinian Jewish first century lens, as much as I possibly can, stripping away all the things that we've added to it. Okay. Daniel writes, other instances when they're trying to figure out the identity of Jesus. Talk to me about that one, Daniel. Turn your mic on. Let me know what you
got. Hey there. Ruth had mentioned regarding reincarnation, so I was expounding upon that. The other example that came to my mind regarding people in the Bible believing in reincarnation would have been when I think it's in Matthew or it's in John. I forget, but
When they think he's Elijah.
right, when they think he's Elijah. So I was thinking that could be the only other case where you could think, or you could pin a argument for reincarnation.
I don't think that one would hold up. Mainly because that would just be an appearance of a prophet. They believe the prophets would return, and they believe that they would speak. I mean, later Jesus is standing there next to Moses and Elijah on either side, right? Like you have these other instances of that. People think John the Baptist is Elijah, and the reason, but they had good reason for thinking that. I mean, John the Baptist literally dressed like Elijah.
Yeah,
he's wearing the mantle of Elijah. He's wearing the sort of the animal skin, like pelt. He's eating the diet. He's like a reincarnation of both Elijah and Elisha. He's doing those things together. And Jesus himself literally picks up. So Jesus is raising a little girl from the dead in the same way that Elisha did. He's doing things Elisha did. And then you have also Jesus, one of Elijah's big, not Elisha, Elijah, his big threat was, look, God's people, if you don't get this together and start honoring and following God, God's going to invite the Gentiles in and replace you, like invite them in to take your spot, and he's going to do the work through them. And then Jesus does that. He says that, and he kicks the door open, and now he's king of both Jews and Gentiles. So Jesus is both Elijah and Elisha. He's also Moses. He's the reincarnation of Moses, because of Matthew presents Jesus like Moses, like no other. He's on the side of a mountain like Sinai, proclaiming the law, bringing the new law down the mountain, re-quoting the old law and quoting new law. He's doing all the things that Moses did. So Jesus is sort of this quote unquote reincarnation. He's like the presence of all these prophets rolled into one. I don't particularly hold to the idea that any of them believed in reincarnation, but you have to point out there are some interesting things.
They believed in a returning.
What's that?
They believed in a returning.
Oh yeah. I mean, they believe that these people were present with God and still present in this world and could appear,
Okay.
So yeah.
Cool.
And I think that's what I wanted to give you guys today, was this view of Eastern and Western. A lot of people just have no idea.
Yeah.
Why they're reading what they're reading. You read some Augustine, and then you read some Irenaeus, and you're like, how are these two in the same religion? That's where the creeds come in. But people don't realize that philosophers were very important in the Greek world, and law and systems and kingdoms, ways of talking about that, were very important in the Western world. And so these things go in different directions. I will say, to this day, the only church that is probably practicing as close to what the original church was doing in the first century is the North African churches, the Ethiopian, I want to say Coptic churches. The Ethiopian churches in North Africa are practicing, and rumor has it in church history that Mark is the missionary to that area, that Mark actually brought the gospel there, and planted those churches. So they have this claim on Christianity. They also have a claim on ancient Judaism. The Queen of Sheba apparently gave birth to Solomon's child, and there's this whole thing where they not only link themselves to Judaism, they also link themselves to Christianity, and they have never changed how they practice Christianity since day one. And so if you actually want to see what early Christianity, like 2nd century Christianity looked like, 3rd century Christianity, you're gonna have to travel there to look at it. There's even a lot of people that believe that they have the Ark of the Covenant, all kinds of stuff. There's Netflix documentaries and everything. All of that is incredible and fascinating to talk about. How much of it's real, who knows? But I think they're probably practicing it at least as about the same as the 3rd century Christians were. So yeah, I think that's it for today. That's what I have. And so next week, I'm going to pick one of these church fathers, and well, not for next week because we're doing this every 2 weeks now, the church history one. So next week we're doing on Tuesday, Bible for lunch, and then the week after that we'll do church history for lunch again, and then we'll jump into some of these Eastern or Western church fathers and see what they were doing, what they were up to, what they were writing about, and give you some maybe primary source recommendations. So until then, stay home, stay safe, and don't go anywhere. That's the only advice we've all been given, and that's how you can save the world, by doing nothing. But good to see you all. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you.
Yep.